I think it's time to start, right? Sounds okay, Jack and Adrian? All right, great. Welcome everyone. Just give me a moment to share screen. Welcome to session 1A of this conference, which is off to a great start this morning. And I'm so glad that all of you have joined us for this conversation. I'm Thaddeus Pulaski, the Managing Director of the Center for Resilient Cities and Landscapes at Columbia University. We're located at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, and our research center uses the tools of planning and design to help communities and ecosystems survive and thrive in a world in crisis. And we're particularly focused on climate change, but as we have come to better understand through our work, climate change is not unrelated to other crises of inequality and growing concentration of wealth and power in the hands of fewer people, often along lines of race and ethnicity, and a global economic system that is premised on enclosure, extraction, and exploitation. This, by the way, is my hometown, Johnstown, Pennsylvania. It's a place that is famous for flooding. There has been a kind of unmanaged retreat here from environmental and economic disaster for the last 40 or 50 years. Nevertheless, the history of this place, the people there, my ancestors who were European immigrants who came to work in the booming coal and steel industries, have formed my worldview. Some of those people have chosen to stay, like my parents, and their attachment to this place informs my perspective. Others have stayed for other reasons. And I think we all know that where we choose to live is a series of incremental decisions that is based upon available options to us at any given moment in time. But what I'm glad to say is that many people who have stayed there for whatever reason are engaged in reimagining a thriving and a resilient place there today, a very different shape than what existed in my childhood. And that I find inspiring. So what I've been hearing so far today, and especially from the opening speakers, is an effort to understand climate change and its impacts in the context of social vulnerability, and a real acknowledgement that that social vulnerability is a condition that is often created, reinforced, or supported by the power structures in which many of us labor. Universities and think tanks not excluded, but also corporations and governments and sometimes NGOs. We all have good intentions and we care about the future of the planet, our own communities and our families, but to really authentically engage in this work of climate change adaptation, I think a lot of us are feeling that we need to know more about how we got here, how our systems have failed us broadly as a society. Other panels are going to talk about stormwater management systems, insurance systems, governance systems. They're all related, but we're going to focus on our housing system. And I've invited 3 people to talk about 3 different communities that they know well from 3 different perspectives. So let me advance my slide for, here's the 3 places. So first we'll hear from Dr. David Todd Lawrence, who is Associate Professor of English and Different Studies and Director of the English Graduate Program at St. Thomas University in St. Paul. Todd has co-written the book about a particularly tragic instance of unmanaged retreat, which he'll tell us about. He'll tell us the story from the position of ethnographer. And Karen Blondell will talk about a neighborhood in Brooklyn that may someday face a kind of retreat. Karen is now the founder of the New York City Public Housing Civic Association. She will speak as a community activist and leader. Karen has also just been selected as a Harvard Loeb Fellow this year, which I'm very pleased to congratulate her on. And finally, we'll hear from Deborah Morris, who was a Harvard Loeb Fellow last year. Before that, she was the Executive Director of Resilience at New York City Housing Preservation and Development. And Deborah and I worked a lot together in the months and years after Hurricane Sandy in city government, and she'll speak from the perspective of a policymaker. And the title for this panel, I just want to explain because I was meant to be a little bit provocative, it's something that I heard from a very well-intentioned FEMA staffer at a community meeting at 3 weeks after Hurricane Sandy. She said it to me as an aside, and it struck me as kind of callous and naive, but nevertheless, we began to ask people this question: why do you live here? And they listed out the reasons for us. I remember the first response was the birds. We love the birds. People also said they love the water, that these are their people. That's where their family lives. That's where their history is. It's our place in the world. It's where I met my husband, where we want our kids to grow up. And this was, I'll say, it's important to understand, this was a predominantly white, predominantly middle class, predominantly homeowning neighborhood. And after Hurricane Sandy, we also started to ask people whether they wanted to stay or go at these housing forums and in different neighborhoods that were affected by this storm. And I was just thinking about this morning, this question about asking people using a little sticky dot, whether you want to stay and whether you want to go, and how complex that question is. And even just thinking about in our own lives, like how complex that decision has been for us at different points in our lives. Like, what choice do we actually have? What help will we get in either case? So in many places, people chose to live in the same place after Hurricane Sandy and dealt with enormous struggle. And in some cases, they had a lot of help from rapid repairs program, build it back program, charity, and their own social networks. But people don't always have so much choice. And in fact, the choices that Americans have around housing are getting narrower and narrower. Rent burden is increasing disproportionately with race. Home ownership is declining. The gap between Black home ownership at 47% and white home ownership at 73% is the highest it has been nationally in 50 years. That's the result of a legacy of redlining, discriminatory zoning, subprime lending, and more recently, perhaps gentrification is driving this, making it harder for Black households to get or keep a home in cities. So where do people go? That's the question that probably should precede, why do people live here? Where does a population of increasing inequality go in the housing landscape with fewer and fewer options for the middle class and people struggling to join the middle class? Perhaps we need more emphasis on the roots of the crisis than how to manage the outfall. So with that, I'll just stop sharing and turn it over to Todd to tell us more about Pinhook. Todd, are you there?
I'm here. Excuse me. Thank you. Thanks, Todd. And I'll try to share my screen now. Okay. So yeah, thanks again, Thad, and thanks for the invitation to speak to this audience. It's not an audience that I speak to a lot, and I'm excited to share the story of a group of people who I've known and been working with for 10 years now. Pinhook is a small community, a village in southeast Missouri, in what we call the Boot Hill of Missouri, and their town was destroyed in 2011 during the Great Flood, Mississippi Flood of 2011, when the Army Corps of Engineers breached a levee and operated a floodway. The town was inside of that floodway. So I'll talk a little bit about that as I go, and I'm going to kind of read a little bit and talk a little bit and show you some images and try to, as much as I can, convey the story of the people of Pinhook as they told it to us. My co-author Elaine Lawless, who I wrote the book with, we both, have formed strong bonds with the people of Pinhook, and their story is really what's most important to us. I'm going to be speaking from that perspective, and then at the end a little bit as a ethnographer, as a folklorist and ethnographer. So the story of Pinhook, Missouri begins with a group of 5 Black men migrating from Tennessee to Missouri in the early 1940s, seeking land to buy and an opportunity to build a safe and stable life for themselves and their families. They bought land and settled inside the Birds Point, New Madrid floodway, land that no one else wanted and the only land that was available for Black people to purchase at the time. They built a life in that place, a tight-knit community of Black farmers that attracted other Black people to come and join them. They came and they thrived and were happy even as they struggled to make the swampy land productive for farming. And as they dealt with the powerful Mississippi River, which pushed against and sometimes escaped its banks on a regular basis. Backwater flooding was a yearly issue they learned to deal with, and more serious flooding occurred every few years, 1973 being one that everyone we talked to remembered as being particularly rough. Their houses were damaged and they had to be repaired. But for the most part, the water only came up to, their front steps, or they would get a few inches of water in their houses. Never before had their houses been submerged as it would be in 2011. The floodway had never been used during the time that Pinhook folks lived there, and they had no real reason to expect that it would. While folks knew that the government held the right to flood their homes at any time if they wanted to, the ones we talked to had never considered it as a very real possibility. And yet at 10:02 p.m. on the night of May 2nd, 2011, Major General Michael Walsh, commander of the Mississippi Valley Division of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, ordered that the upper fuse plug of the front side levee of the floodway be breached by an explosion, what he officially referred to at the emergency press conference that night as, quote, operating the project. From that moment on, when the residents of the village of Pinhook were initially displaced, they have received no help or support from the very federal government responsible for that displacement. According to our interviews with displaced Pinhook residents, they were not involved in decision-making conversations about whether or not to breach the levee. They were not officially informed that such conversations were even taking place. Once the decision had been made to breach the levee, they were not given effective notification that they needed to evacuate. They were not provided assistance with evacuating their families or moving their possessions. Once displaced, they were not offered any financial assistance of any kind to help with temporary housing, rent support, relocation, anything like that. They were denied support from FEMA because the circumstances of their displacement were not the direct result of a natural disaster, but rather of the Army Corps of Engineers following long established procedures designed to save the town of Cairo, Illinois across the river and farmland on the Illinois side of the river. So just to give you a little idea of where Pinhook is located and what the floodway looks like, here are two images on this slide. One of the state of Missouri, and you can see here in this southeast corner, the Boot Heel of Missouri. And this image here then is a sort of detailed image of the Birds Point, New Madrid floodway. And you can see in the center that Pinhook is located there. There's another very small community called Wolf Island that's also located, but Pinhook was the only incorporated community inside the bounds of the floodway. And the floodway is, I'll go to the next slide because I have a more detailed image. This on the left, this basically shows the Mississippi rivers and tributary system, which is a series of mechanisms designed to mitigate flooding along the Mississippi River below the city of St. Louis. This image shows basically from Memphis down. So Birds Point, New Madrid floodway would be right up here, just out of the picture. But on the right is a detailed image of the floodway, and you can sort of see at this north end of the floodway is the fuse plug, which is used to open the floodway or to operate the floodway. It's 2,000 feet long and is run through with pipes that they put explosive inside and blow a hole, and it lets in about 550,000 cubic feet per second of water into 130,000 acre floodway. So it very quickly, the water comes in with a lot of force. A lot of water comes in, and for the people of Pinhook, their town was submerged with water within a few days, and the water stayed for over a week. So when the water receded out of the south end of the floodway, their houses were left partially, demolished, and even if they weren't knocked over, they were totally uninhabitable because they'd been submerged for so long. So on May 2nd, of this year, actually, let me move back and say on May 2nd of, yeah, I'll start here. May 2nd of this year marked 10 years since the destruction of the village of Pinhook. And here you can see an image taken from the air of the village. This is about almost a week after the water entered the floodway. So this is pretty low level of water compared to what it was at sort of height. For 8 of those 10 years, Pinhook folks told their story to anyone who would listen to them. They appealed to politicians at the local, state, and federal level. They applied for financial aid and relief many times over. They made application for numerous forms of financial assistance from local, state, and federal sources, all of which were unsuccessful or fell through at the last minute. The citizens of Pinhook did everything they knew how to do to get help in rebuilding their town outside of the floodway, which is what their plan for what they wanted to do. They were not trying to game the system. They only wanted to get what was right, or to have happen to them what was right. As our dear friend, collaborator, and the former mayor of Pinhook, Deborah Robinson, told us many, many different times, she said, quote, "We're not out to get more than what we had. We're just out to get what we had back." And I'll show you some images now of the damage. This is almost a year after the flood. So this is just a sort of image of, this is actually Twan Robinson's house, so Deborah's sister. And this is the first time I ever went to visit Pinhook was a year after the flood happened. So I never saw the Pinhook personally when it was flooded, only in the distant aftermath. And this house, we'll take a look inside of this house. So you can see the damage inside of the house. It's pretty reminiscent of Katrina, the damage of Katrina, for example. But these houses are clearly uninhabitable, and no help was provided to the folks to relocate. And I'll leave it. This is a picture of Deborah right here, and I'll leave it here as I move on. Eventually, there were 9 modest new houses that were built in the spring of 2018 after 7 years of appealing for help. It was the generous assistance of private religious organizations, Catholic Charities of Southern Missouri, and Mennonite Disaster Services that made it possible. With money from a community development block grant, donated materials from partnering organizations, and volunteer labor, the houses were built in a nondescript neighborhood in Sikeston, Missouri, which is about 20 miles away from where Pinhook was located. Not at the original Pinhook site, or even somewhere in the countryside outside of the spillway where the Pinhook folks had hoped to build together as a community. As always, Pinhook folks were grateful, however, and happily accepted the homes built for them in 10 weeks by volunteer Amish laborers who had traveled all the way from Ohio. They were brought in by Mennonite Disaster Services. They were tired. The people of Pinhook were tired and perhaps beaten down by their efforts. They simply wanted to move on with their lives. They thanked their God and they settled in their new homes, expressing no anger or resentment about how they had been treated. And my co-author was there on the day that the houses were dedicated in Sikeston, and sort of watched the proceedings and saw, Deborah and her sister and her mother and some of the other folks who were getting houses, and they performed happiness and sort of thankfulness. And I think they genuinely were, but I think she talked about sort of sensing that there was a kind of exhaustion and a kind of resentment that she sensed from them, and that they were being asked to be thankful for something that was their right. And that wasn't even really a replacement for what they had lost. I'm going to show you just some pictures. This is the beginning of the construction of the new homes, which were built. 7 of them are built together in this neighborhood in southern Sikeston, Missouri, and they went up in 10 weeks. So here's the beginning, and then this is after the construction is done. So this is the same house that you were looking at, I believe, and this is Twan Robinson's house. This is her mother, Aretha's house across the street, and I'm actually standing, when I took this picture, in the backyard of Deborah's houses, and there are other houses down here to the left of the picture that make up the rest of the houses in the community. This image was actually taken at Pinhook, the Pinhook site in 2018 when they celebrated their homecoming, which they have celebrated every year, even since the destruction of their town. And Mennonite Disaster Services, a guy named Jeff Kohler, he secretly built them this picnic shelter, again using donated materials and volunteer labor, so that they could come to their place once a year and have a celebration and be in the place that meant so much to them. And when it was first built, it doesn't have a floor. And I heard Jeff tell Deborah that I'll come back and I will pour a concrete pad underneath this so you can have a floor. And she said, no, I want to take my shoes off and put my feet in the dirt. I want my feet in the ground. So I don't ever want anything between me and the ground when I'm standing in this building. So the experiences of Deborah and her community bring to light important considerations essential to any discussion of how to deal with the realities of climate displacement and migration and responses to it, such as managed retreat or resilience-based policy. On one hand, we can see the case of Pinhook as an example of displaced citizens being persistent and resilient, but that story would erase the multiple forms of violence enacted on these folks of this community from the moment they first arrived in Southeast Missouri looking to buy land, to the day that a handful of them took possession of their new homes in Sykeston and were expected to perform gratitude for receiving a questionable replacement for something that had been taken from them unjustly and without their consent. As was the case then, is still and will be increasingly in coming years. Those 5 Black men who migrated to Southeast Missouri in the early 1940s as marginalized folks were pushed into precarious space to live and farm. Where they ended up living was not a function of a choice they made so much as it was of policies and practices that have tended to historically to corral Black, Indigenous, people of color, and other marginalized folks into spaces of precarity, spaces that are more vulnerable to environmental disaster, whether natural or, in this case, human-made. Our solutions to this problem must consider intangible cultural factors such as community, tradition, and the importance of place. What Deborah told me, and I asked her not too long ago if she felt like she had a home, and she said, I have a roof over my head. My home will always be Pinhook. And what she means when she said that, or what I understood her to say, is that Pinhook as a home place would never be replaced. Though they had not lost their community, they had lost a place which had defined them for so many years. It still existed on a map, but they could never live there again. Deborah's mother, Miss Aretha Robinson, left her home in 2011 when the flood happened. And though she still is alive, she's never returned to Pinhook to see what was left. She never went back. She told me that she couldn't bear to see that place without her beloved house, which eventually her children had demolished and hauled away. We all know the old saying, if these walls could talk, which references the ability of material structures to become a part of who we are and to hold memories and experiences. The same is true of geographic spaces like Pinhook, a nondescript patch of ground at the intersection of 2 county roads that held so much importance for the people who lived there. Asking people to leave their places, even when it is in service of saving their lives and property, must be done with care and an understanding that leaving is just another kind of displacement, which is ultimately a kind of violence, a separating of people from the places they have known and loved, where they built community and traditions. Recently, a panel I was a part of at the American Folklore Society annual meeting considered questions of climate migration and what cultural workers such as folklorists like myself could offer to help people in the preservation of community, culture, and traditions likely to be disrupted during and following future displacements. We also began to think about how we could help established communities to receive climate migrants and displaced people, to embrace the culture and traditions they bring with them and value them as part of a transforming, diverse community and shared place. As a folklorist and ethnographer, I have come to understand that what I bring to this discussion is not any expertise about climate change or policy, but rather an approach to radical listening that attempts to center the experiences and narratives of marginalized people. a significant element of the injustice of what happened to the people of Pinhook is that they were not acknowledged or listened to. They were treated with indifference and victimized by a powerful kind of erasure. During the official decision-making process, it was as if they didn't exist, as if their town didn't exist. When I have given talks about what happened to Pinhook over the years, people often ask me, well, how many people live there? As if the value of a community could be measured by the number of people living in a place. We must endeavor to shift the metric for determining the value of communities and their places from economic measures to ones that acknowledge cultural, traditional, and community significance. One way this can be fostered is through a collaborative ethnography that embraces and encourages marginalized communities to tell their own stories and to mark their rightful places in the world. Collaborative and community-based research can help enable voices and agency in marginalized communities by working to create environments where research collaborators can be empowered to take agency and wield their own voices in powerful ways. In the end, the government, which represents us all and acts in our name, in the case of Pinhook, failed the people of Pinhook. At every point in this tragic story, it failed to see these people or consider the value of a small group of Black farmers living in a rural community in the middle of a floodway. It bears repeating that the basis on which value is determined in order to inform decision-making relies on a metrics which privileges material value and overlooks the value of community, culture, and place. If we first interrogate the policy and processes that position people in places where they are, and we listen to their stories about those places and the communities they support, we will be in a much better position to make decisions not about them, but with them, that take into account their vision for shared and reimagined futures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Todd. That's such an important story for us all to hear. And this, I want to thank you also for crossing disciplines to come talk to us from this field of folklore and ethnography. We have so much to learn. Coming from my space of planning and design, I feel like we have so much to learn about radical listening, and your book and your work in this is really instructive for us. So thank you, and let's continue this conversation right now with Karen Blondell. And Karen, are you there? And
sure.
Yeah, welcome, Karen. I'd love for you to just share with us about your community in Red Hook.
Sure. Before I share about Red Hook, I do want to expound a little bit on Todd's conversation. I was actually born in Coney Island, Brooklyn, back in 1963. At that time, there were bungalows that people used for summer homes. But by 1963, those summer homes became year-round homes for families like mine. So I remember my grandfather's house, and I had to walk behind an actual house. And then we would find its structure with these metal stairs, and we would walk up them. And that's where my granddad lived. My granddad came from Trinidad. The rest of my family on my maternal side are American Black Indians. And so when we talk about where we live, I think about the Black migration of 1917 to 1970, where a lot of my family members migrated from Georgia, from Florida, up to New York to escape Jim Crow and other violence towards American Blacks and Indians. I even can trace my family to the Trail of Tears, where we have family members buried in Arizona in the Indian cemeteries. And so, you know, when I think about the bungalows and how they were, you know, summer homes for the rich, but became our necessitated homes year round. And then when you fast forward to urban renewal of the 70s, when they started developing these model cities in Coney Island. I remember that was the first time my dad had a job that really stood out. All the other jobs were like very well, this was laborers. He was doing construction, but he was proud of the fact that he was helping to build these model buildings, these public housing campuses. And when Sandy hit in 2012, I had just paid my last visit to the aquarium with one of my grandchildren, and not knowing that that would be the last time I would see the aquarium in that state. And so I was living in Red Hook in 2012 when Sandy hit. Again, I didn't choose to live in Red Hook. For many Black Americans, the choice is made by government and by policy. Because of redlining, back in 1937, when the security maps were being made for the 30-year mortgages, Billie Holiday was singing Strange Fruit at the same exact time. So, you know, we weren't even really a part of the equation when it came to redlining. Redlining was really around immigrants like Italians and Polish. They were considered the intruders at that particular time, which was not even 100 years ago. So growing up in Coney Island, I went to, they had a Navy enlistment booth right there outside of Nathan's. And I remember because my mom had died when I was 15 from multiple sclerosis. And I went to sign up for the Navy, and I really scored really high. And at the same time, I became pregnant, and I decided I wanted to keep my child. And so I deferred the dream to go to the Navy. And lo and behold, about a year later, I was given an opportunity to move into Red Hook. And I was like, Red Hook? Where's that at? You know? And so when I visited Red Hook, the first thing that I saw was it was an industrial area, very industrial. I could walk 2 blocks with no pedestrian attractions, no storefronts. I would just see like huge warehouses. And it seemed like every time I walked past a particular street light, instead of the light going on like it does outside of people's homes, the light would actually go off. And I was like, I'm getting out of here as quick as possible. I'm not staying here. Mind you, this was back in 1982. As I started to learn Red Hook, I started to appreciate Red Hook for its diversity. Red Hook has waterfront. Red Hook has open spaces. Red Hook has brownfields. I mean, we have so many different challenges as well as magical spaces in Red Hook that over time I became very bonded to Red Hook, and I wanted to become civically engaged. So when Sandy hit, I remember I live on the first floor. I was just kind of up listening to what the progress of the storm was. And then I heard someone crying on the stoop, and I went to see who was there. And when I looked out, I saw the water coming in, and it was like a tsunami. It wasn't really high, but it was just like a big flush, and all the water just poured into the neighborhood. And I started seeing cars floating and people in despair. And so the water did retreat within about a half an hour. But the problem with the water that came into Red Hook is that it was salt water. So we had a lot of salinization. We lost a lot of trees immediately through salinization. We also lost all of our boilers and our mechanical and electrical equipment. But the thing about Red Hook is that Red Hook was always very insulated because of the design of the Brooklyn Queens Expressway, and other redlining infrastructure. And so for probably 20, 30 years, being a neighborhood by itself was a deficit. But here came Hurricane Sandy, and it became a plus because we were such a small town type neighborhood that we were able to quickly organize around each other. So I remember going outside and seeing the Honorable Judge Alex Calabrese, whose court is about a block from my house. And he was like, Karen, do you have batteries? Is your phone working? I'm like, yes, my phone's working. Do you need to charge yours? And this is the spirit that Red Hook really cultivated back in 2012, where we decided that we would be there for each other. And in doing that, we created the Red Hook local leaders, the Red Hook Ready plan, where we would literally, everyone would know where they could go to get food, to get medical supplies, to get, to fill out forms, etc. And we really started getting to work on how to survive and possibly thrive in an area that is waterfront. And so in doing that, the first thing that happened was the Reddick Houses, which is the largest campus in the world, other than I think it's Queensbridge in Queens. But what happened was we got together and we were able to acquire $550 million to replace our boilers and our mechanical parts. But this meant that we had to replace them above the base flood elevation. And so right now, today, we're sitting in a huge construction zone. It is very disturbing. It's disturbing because we know that beneath the Red Hook soil or in the subsystem, there is a lot of toxins because this area was used as dye factories for manufacturing gas plants, foundries, all kind of chemical uses and factories were a part of Red Hook's history. And now we have so many people living here. We love this place. We want to save it. We don't want to talk about managed retreat, but we know we have to. At the same time, we've been working on resiliency processes. We've looked at the elevations that we're able to tie into to create a permanent perimeter with floatable, by elevating certain parts of our streets and spaces. We want to connect those spaces in order to keep surge and tidal flooding out of this particular neighborhood. We've also invested $100 million in our ball field and our stadium area, which is already elevated. So we're using design that allows us to look at the spaces that are elevated and connect those with like streets that are elevated or some type of barrier. But when I'm talking about this to tell you that aside from that happening, the trees that were destroyed by the surge, a part of the resiliency is the construction that I'm talking about. And the thing that disturbs me the most is that we've lost almost 600 to 1,000 more trees in Red Hook for resiliency. So these trees normally take about 50 years to mature. These trees were mature trees. They offered a lot of shading. They absorb water, and they also could help filter particle matters, 2.5 and other things like that. So when I think about managed retreat, I'm ready to fight in regards to how do we hold the water back? How do we elevate the buildings? But at the same time, I'm still struggling with construction as harassment, with the loss of the trees, with zoning that allows for last mile trucking to come in the middle of our resiliency processes and just set up 3-4 warehouses in our community. I think as planners and as designers, we can't just look at the building. We have to look at nature. We have to look at culture. We have to look at all the things that Todd talked about, including when Todd talked about how they wanted to pour a concrete floor, and the woman said, "No, I want to feel the earth." American Black Indians are really close to nature, and it's really important that when we design things for the future, we don't design in a way that eliminates nature and the things that nature is responsible for, like oxygen and filtration and etc. And so I just wanted to talk to you about those challenges and looking at like how Blacks have been pushed around the country from a bungalow to a tenement with rats, from that to public housing, you know, but never anything new. You know, it's extremely disheartening to know that the generation before me, my mom's generation, my granddad, and even myself, we've been bill penned by policies and by redlining, to the point where when they did the Where We Live workshops here in New York to affirmatively further fair housing, I had to literally push in for public housing residents and say, why don't you have public housing residents answering that question? And so when we sat to answer that question, that's when I realized that I didn't really make the choice to live where I live. I was mandated here. But now that I'm here and I've matured, I'm ready to take a stand and fight for Red Hook. So while we're talking about managed retreat, I'm still having a conflict internally because I'm about fighting for Red Hook. And I'm going to end it right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. That your community leadership has been really inspiring to see, and such a great addition to this conversation today. I want to turn it over now to Deborah Morris. Deborah, are you with us? And you're going to share a recording?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. My name is Deborah Morris. I'm an urban planner and designer focused on climate adaptation, risk mitigation, and affordable housing. And I want to thank Columbia University for hosting this series of incredible discussions. My co-panelists for having a provocative session this morning, and all of you for coming to listen and learn. I plan to talk about the interrelationship between vulnerability and the built environment, and explore some lessons learned in New York City from my time directing resiliency planning, policy, and acquisitions at the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, including lessons learned from managing the city's property acquisition and buyout program that was part of Sandy recovery. I pre-recorded my presentation because I have a 1-week-old newborn in the next room with my very supportive partner, but I'm excited to share in the discussion live with the Q&A. So Jack, please share my presentation. Thank you. Good morning. I'm starting this presentation with this image because I think in many ways it represents so much of the problem of framing in climate change responses and discussions, and in particular discussions around risk and patterns of land use, as we often look at the issue in isolation, an irresponsibly located home positioned against a threatening and evolving environmental force. I think this sets up a false dichotomy around the root causes of vulnerability and the nature of transition. I think it is critical we look at this at an environmental hazard and the evolving climate crisis and how it interrelates with human needs and the ability to access safe and stable housing. As our local and global populations continue to grow, this means we must learn how to do more with less by using renewable energy, finding significant efficiencies in how we feed and house ourselves. And although the changing climate makes it more difficult to predict weather and severe events, what is not unpredictable is that lower income people, predominantly non-white people, locally and globally, are significantly more likely to be affected by climate change and severe weather. So what can we do? One option, the subject of this conference, is to attempt to move away from risk entirely and occasionally make space for nature-based risk mitigation solutions. And often, it is tempting to blame people who need to move. Why do people live here anyway? They should know better than to live in places like that. What would they expect? Although I can understand the rationale behind this perspective, I do not believe it probes deeply into why people live where they live and if they had any choice in the matter. Also, where are the places that are entirely free of hazard? In the context of this conference, and searching for ways to cope with extreme physical hazard by changing how and where people live, rarely do we successfully reconcile non-environmental forces such as economic inequality, redlining, exclusionary zoning, or other fundamental threats to autonomy, which have pushed people into positions of vulnerability. It is essential to consider these significant social and political forces to understand vulnerability. So to illustrate this argument, I want to speak about the challenge and patterns of housing in New York City and about Edgemere, a community in the Eastern Rockaways. Access to housing opportunity in New York is unequal. New York City is economically and racially segregated. New York City is also a city of renters. As of 2018, 2/3 of New York City residents rented their homes. Renters cross the economic spectrum from very high to very low income. Yet finding housing for everyone in New York is challenging. The city's vacancy rate is 3.5% and housing is expensive. The population of the New York region has grown by over 1 million residents over the last 2 decades. Yet the supply of housing has stagnated. This combination of high cost and limited availability is a daily disaster. Over 60,000 people seek housing in an emergency homeless shelter every night. Despite an aggressive affordable housing construction program, the city of New York does not have housing sufficient for all who want to live within it. This often pushes those with the fewest resources and least agency into living in areas and conditions with significant challenges: high costs, overcrowding, low quality, physical risk. Yet locally and regionally, construction of housing is suppressed through zoning and environmental regulations. Often, in order to serve narrow interests, community members will use environmental regulations to oppose all housing development, including affordable housing, citing issues such as stormwater management and overburdened infrastructure to prevent housing construction or stoke fears about community change and gentrification. In a region as dense and developed as New York, this combination of restrictions and opposition makes it impossible to develop new housing in safer and high opportunity areas. Overall, 1 million people live within New York City's 100-year floodplain, a number that will increase with sea level rise. It is essential that we recognize the impact of the legacy of decades of racist housing policy, where in the 1930s, the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation assigned grades to neighborhoods based on several factors, most notably race. Black and immigrant neighborhoods were deemed undesirable, leaving BIPOC households unable to access mortgage financing to purchase or maintain their homes, and also making them unable to move to areas deemed more desirable. There's a significant overlap between areas deemed hazardous by the Homeowners Loan Corporation and flood risk. And although redlining was outlawed in 1968, its effects are still felt, as areas with high physical risk were the only places where BIPOC households were allowed and able to live. We can see the results of this most acutely in the Rockaways, a barrier island off southern Queens. Communities to the west are entirely white and middle class, while communities to the east were redlined. Bungalows, deemed slums, were cleared as part of urban development plans led by Robert Moses. The result is that housing that could not be financed through traditional banks and a significant concentration of public housing and income-restrictive cooperatives are located in the most flood-prone portion of the peninsula and of Queens. Housing quality deteriorated as owners were unable to borrow money and as surrounding public land sat vacant. To orient all of you, Edgemere is a community right here. It's not that far from JFK Airport if you've been to New York City. Edgemere is a majority low-income community. Half its residents live in public housing. The other half live in 1 to 4 family homes that are predominantly owner-occupied. Edgemere's residents face some of the longest commute times in New York City. Edgemere has few amenities, has been historically underinvested in, and has significant infrastructural deficits. Like all of the Rockaways, Edgemere is entirely in the floodplain. It also has an especially low-lying bayfront edge, making it exceptionally vulnerable to tidal flooding. Edgemere also experienced significant damage from Hurricane Sandy in 2012. After Hurricane Sandy, given the substantial challenges facing people living in Edgemere, besides flood risk, the City of New York launched a significant community planning initiative to understand how Edgemere residents understood climate risk and learn what residents felt they needed in order to thrive. This included discussing the significant growing challenge of sea level rise facing the existing community. This 18-month effort produced the Resilient Edgemere Community Plan, which I encourage you to read. And this plan is more than just a document. It altered the way the city's disaster recovery resources were deployed, creating an enhanced buyout area to promote managed retreat, a home relocation program, an attached elevated home program, all of which were funded and the work is complete. You should read the plan. But I will highlight that it includes a framework for movement away from the shoreline, as well as short and long-term investments in flood risk management through open space expansion, some reductions in density through zoning, long-term shoreline work, and most notably, the development of new affordable housing. As I mentioned, this plan changed disaster recovery programs. So I want to explain what managed retreat means in the context of disaster-affected renters and owners, and hopefully illustrate the challenge in resolving vulnerability. On the left, this is Desiree's storm-damaged home. And Desiree's family didn't want to sell their property because the money they would receive wouldn't purchase them as much space as they currently had, and they also liked living in Edgemere. They just wanted to be in a slightly safer location and in an elevated home so they wouldn't experience the devastation of another Sandy in the same way. Since New York City had a significant amount of vacant land in this neighborhood, it was possible to relocate Desiree's family home from the most vulnerable portion of the waterfront to a new site a little bit inland in a new construction house. The home is still in the floodplain, but it is a new elevated home, and it keeps a family in a community they love. This is Desiree's family celebrating a wedding in their new home. This is Nicholas's home, a renter. 5 years after Sandy, the house where Nicholas lived was unrepaired, without electricity, and with weak plumbing. The roof leaked, there was significant mold and few furnishings. It was located on the same property behind the house of the homeowner. Nicholas was in his early 20s, unemployed, and struggled with mental health and addiction. In addition to stable, safe housing, Nicholas needed a long-term social worker to help him resolve his health issues and to find employment. While the owner of Nicholas's home had chosen to have his property bought out, Nicholas had not. As a renter, Nicholas did not have a say. If the homeowner participated in the program, Nicholas had to move. The New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development was able to provide Nicholas with a housing choice voucher and moving expenses. Housing choice vouchers help make housing affordable for low-income individuals. Voucher holders pay 30% of their income towards rent and utilities, while the government pays the remainder. Nicholas struggled to find a landlord who was willing to accept his voucher as payment anywhere in New York City. Although illegal, source of income discrimination, which is a new vehicle for racial discrimination, is quite common. The demand for the type of housing and services which Nicholas needs exceeds the supply. When the wait lists for affordable housing and supportive housing are thousands of people long, and voucher holders vastly exceed, housing seekers vastly exceed the supply of available units, the fact that Nicholas happened to be a climate change refugee does not seem reason for priority treatment in wait lists for affordable housing. When I last heard from Nicholas, he had moved in with a friend and was still looking for a landlord who would accept his housing voucher. In my 6 years working on New York City's hurricane recovery team, I participated in hundreds of conversations with city planning staff regarding storm-damaged neighborhoods and areas that face severe flood risk. In discussions of policy tools and potential solutions, the major constituent was consistently framed as a homeowner, living oblivious to or in defiance of physical risk. People with limited housing opportunity overall do not fit easily into this narrative. The well-being and stability of New York City's most low-income households has little to do with access to information about risk. Instead, it is the historic patterns of inequity and the weakness of the American social safety net that creates choice-limiting constraints. Managed retreat may be both a logical and fiscally responsible solution to changing landscapes. However, without a significant investment in the development of comparatively priced housing in communities without risk, reducing the available housing inventory displaces the problem and does not reduce overall human vulnerability. Thank you, and I look forward to the ensuing discussion.
Thanks so much, Deborah. Great to see and to reflect on that work. You know, in city government at the time, the Edgemere plan seemed like very different because, in a way, surprisingly, city government has trouble talking between land use policy, infrastructure, stormwater management, disaster recovery dollars to synthesize all of that work into a single neighborhood plan. Took a lot of hard work, frankly, on your part and the other folks at HPD, but also moving at a pace that was probably uncomfortable. I know it was uncomfortable for other agencies, but you had to really take time and really listen. So I want to start a conversation among us here and invite people to start to put questions in the chat for all of our panel. But you know, Karen, I wanted to come back to you to start off, and then maybe I can ask a variation on this question I'm going to ask Karen to the rest of you, which is, you know, the trees in Red Hook and the trees in Red Hook houses have been like a very instructive moment for me as a resilience planner, because I feel that our performative allyship in some ways can be extremely destructive. And that, you know, when we come to a place and say, oh, we're gonna make this better, make this more resilient, we can also do a lot of harm. And losing 430 mature trees, basically a forest, a rare urban forest that had been maturing for 70 years, it was you know, stripping this neighborhood of ecosystem services during the global pandemic. And those ecosystem services, as you know, that include shading the buildings, which have very thin envelopes and a lot of solar gain during the summer. There's a lot high incidence of respiratory disease and heat-related illnesses, also purifying the air and just creating an atmosphere of comfort and belonging. And I remember I worked at the Department of City Planning when those plans came in, and they showed us all these plans and the consultants, and I was like, well, you know, move this around over here because it'll be more inviting. I didn't know about the trees. I didn't look at the tree plan. Because I didn't live there, I didn't have the tools to ask that question. So I didn't live there at the time. So Karen, what do you think could have gone differently in that post-disaster moment in Red Hook around the Red Hook Resilience Plan?
Yeah, I mean, it created more work for me as an activist in the neighborhood. I had to pivot away from the rezoning that's going on in the next neighborhood over, which is Gowanus. So there's an 80 block rezoning pending along the Gowanus Canal, which is a Superfund cleanup site. Adjacent to the canal, they have a 72-inch main that runs to Red Hook. It's called the Lorraine Bond sewer line. And so we don't have a waste treatment plant in Red Hook. It's in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, because we worked on that in the 90s with a 197A plan, where we fought against that type of environmental burden. And so this underground infrastructure worked well up until now. Now, when we have to fortify our perimeter, our waterfront, to keep surge and tidal flooding out, I'm concerned with a 80 block rezoning in the next neighborhood, where the city's saying that no additional combined sewer overflow is going to go into the canal. To me, that's a legalese. That means it's coming to Red Hook. So I've been trying to raise the alarm in Red Hook while working on the rezoning, that we are connected to whatever happens in Gowanus. We're the lowlands to Gowanus, and the next stop is the water. So we, other neighborhoods, we can't look at trees and sewer as, this is just about my community, because it's not. It all goes downhill. With the trees, first of all, the emotional trauma of being in a pandemic and at the same time seeing all your trees being cut down, and they didn't cut them down and take them out. They cut them down and created a graveyard on our campus. And I'm just sorry I didn't have the pictures to share with you today, because normally I could show you this. There was a huge graveyard of trees that they cut in a certain way so that they could sell them. We didn't benefit off of that either. In New York City, if you're not on public housing ground and you have to take a tree down, there's a value to a tree. I think it's $5,000 a tree. So can you imagine how we feel in public housing, being 1 in 15 New Yorkers, where we don't get a say to the designers before they put in the final design on what's going to happen to our trees? What about climate change and the increase in temperature? What about urban heat island effect? Not only did they take the trees out, but in public housing, there used to be these courtyards with sprinklers. And what I observed was that the seniors would come outside, sit on a bench under a cool tree, and the young people would be playing. And this created another form of social cohesion, where elderly, even if it's only an hour outside, for God's sake, they deserve to be able to come and sit on a bench and in a community. That's not happening anymore. Number one, because of construction, and nobody really thinking of the effect it would have on the elderly. And then number two, once the construction's done, we'll get trees back, but they will not be mature trees. So I'm really waiting to hear what solutions New York City Housing Authority comes up with about these trees. And this is the reason why I started the Public Housing Civic Association, so that we can have a voice when it comes to our trees being cut. We want to hire an arborist. We want to hire a landscaper. We want to maybe create a conservancy just for the public housing landscape. But we have to first come together and learn about these different things. And that's why I'm on this panel talking to you guys.
Thanks, Karen. Maybe I could shift to Todd with a variation on the same question, and then we'll come to you, Deborah, with a third variation. But for Todd, I guess the same thing. Like, what could have been done differently in retrospect in Pinhook, or maybe that's not the right question, and so feel free to take it in how you would phrase it. Well,
Yeah.
what could have been.
Well, I mean, it's interesting to think about, because in some ways Pinhook is done, right? Like it's ended. When we first started working with Pinhook folks, we would ask them to come with us when we were doing conferences or something like that, so that they could tell their stories for themselves, right? So that they could speak for themselves. I still feel somewhat uncomfortable speaking for them, which is not really something I can do, even though they've given me the permission to do that. But in recent time, I've said to Deborah and other people, like, people are still really interested in your story. They're interested in what happened to you. You should come with us and tell them what happened in your own voice, in your own words. And they say, we have to move on. Like we can't do it anymore. We have to move on. And so, a few people in the end, 7 households or 9 total households, all the households were just 1 or 2 people, got these new houses. And it's a very small percentage compared to, the 50 or so people that lived at Pinhook at the time that it was destroyed. But that's been the end. And for they basically had to just make peace with what happened and try to move on with their lives, knowing that, nothing else is going to be done from them. And I recently, like, I didn't even think about this, but the Pinhook, the land that's still their land, but they can't build any habitable dwelling out there unless it's elevated. And all of them, had decided that wasn't what they wanted. But some people still have mortgages for houses out there that don't exist anymore. And then they had to relocate themselves, right? So like, there's just like the way that this kind of violence just sort of like piles on top, one thing after another thing after another thing. And even when, people are trying to help, that can be a kind of violence as well, kind of what Karen was just describing and what you were describing, that. So I think, thinking about Pinhook and other locations, it's really about, how do you be an ally to people? How do you listen to them? How do you go in and see what they want to do? Which is really hard. I mean, I know hearing people talk about that already this morning is very difficult when it feels like people aren't together, or, it's not a sort of, discrete kind of community, and it has pockets and things like that. But it seems like that's the work that has to be done regardless of how difficult it is, because if people don't feel like they are participants in making decisions about what's going to happen to them, then they're going to experience it as violent. And that is traumatic. And that creates, outcomes which, no matter what they are, won't be the right outcomes. So, I mean, in the case of Pinhook, basically this is a town that got, that was erased from the map, that people who were making decisions acted like it didn't exist. And I still don't know to this day whether they really didn't know. Like, that seems impossible to me, that they couldn't have known that this town existed inside of that spillway. So I don't know whether they really didn't know, or whether they lie about it, whether they're just lying about it. And either way, that's a problem, right? Either way, that's a problem.
Thanks, Todd. I think this violence that's exercised, or as you said, operating the project, which is just like the most dystopian Orwellian term for flooding a town, a community, is really instructive. But it happens everywhere, right? Like, this is not a limited circumstance. So Deborah, let me ask, did you feel that in Sandy, that there were decisions being made, particularly in some of the communities, like lower income communities where you were focused? Did it feel like, obviously the storm was a kind of violence, but then the recovery. And how do you think the city, all of us included, myself included, how do you think in retrospect we try to either acknowledge that violence or like actually create a different kind of experience? And I don't know what you think in retrospect.
No, I mean, I think it's a really provocative question. And I think that's, one of the nice things about being able to speak about a public project no longer as a public official, because I can be a little bit more candid. Working citywide, I'll hone in on Edgemere, but I think it is really interesting the range of communities we worked in that were affected by Sandy, and the different forms of violence, both by the structure of the federal programs and tools we were trying to use as local officials, the structure of government and trying to engage with disaster victims, and then actually like community members with each other. And I actually think it's really important to bring that up, which is, New York City's waterfront communities are very unlike Pinhook. They're heterogeneous. There are very cohesive communities, but there are always people within those communities that associate with other communities. And in, working with the white Republican, generally middle-class communities of Staten Island, but still with low-income homeowners and renters within those communities, like one of the most appalling things for me as a public official was hearing what community members said about each other and what should happen to their neighbors, and trying to thread the needle of listening when to anyone with any ethical spine, like they're actually what was being said about other members of the community was, and what that fate should be, was totally unacceptable and beyond. It wasn't racist, everyone was white, but it was discriminatory, and certainly along economic strata. And I think it's important to bring that up in this context of talking about managed retreat, because I think it underlines the importance of like really thinking about what places people in the context they're in and what gives them autonomy over their choices. Like there were a number of homeowners who had no choice other than to rebuild their homes because of the state of their mortgage, and that there was nowhere else they felt they could go, where at the same time their neighbors were like, why should there be small homes here? We would like to see New Dorp Beach be a community of a suburban community of large homes on large lots, and these bungalows are, that's the past. What's the future? When you come to Edgemere, where, on one hand, I'm like very happy to talk to public officials and anyone using FEMA funds or CDBGDR about the community planning process we managed and the way we brought together funds and tried to bring in a really diverse set of perspectives through both outreach and education and back and forth. And that, like, I think that's a really solid planning document compared to certainly what you see in a lot of communities trying to deal with those funds, and also trying to project a future that does reflect what a significant number of Edgemere residents want to see in Edgemere. But there are the amount of discord even within Edgemere about how residents saw the future of Edgemere and what residents wanted for themselves and for their neighbors. There's a lot of diversity there. And I don't think it's possible to have one solution. And as someone who doesn't live in Edgemere, I am a fourth generation New Yorker who is from Queens. So that gave me like maybe a little bit more credibility than some public officials, but not, I didn't grow up in the Rockaways. I didn't grow up in Edgemere. I'm white. I have a master's degree from, an Ivy League school. Like there's, that's not their experience, and my experience is different. And I found it incredibly challenging working with my colleagues in continually trying to bring in checks of like what, rational planning is, what what the funds we're trying to deploy, because I think everyone, actually the intention was, this is a community that has not been invested in a long time, and we could spend, I think in the end, we ended around $600 million going into Edgemere, which is a huge amount of money. And so the intention was, how do we bring resources to this community in a way that it will make people's lives better, and also check all these boxes for these federal programs that are very, very complicated. And I think that in itself is an achievement, but there are many things that I look back on in like absolute horror. And I got to know so many people and residents, and in some ways I have incredible passion and compassion and empathy for their position. But I also look at, you know, holding a line on a program, because it's hard to run a program that, even if you're relocating 9 households, which is what we did in Edgemere, each one of those was like a very retail, complicated thing to do. And still there were moments where I was like, it's a program, we just have to draw the line, cut it off. And that feels so callous and terrible. And, you know, as a program operator, I had to make choices and work with other people above me and below me to get money out the door and to get things moving. But that's heartbreaking. Those choices affect people that are not me. And I would much rather be in a place that people are making choices for themselves.
Thanks, Deborah. That was really, I appreciate the candor and the reflection. And Karen, you had your hand up. You want to go next?
I wanted to, because as Deborah was talking, and she was, you know, talking about Staten Island and how even in a white community, people find discriminatory things or things to say or do. So can you imagine what that feels like for a Black American, you know, for a person of color? It's 100 times the power of what you saw. Even here in Red Hook, I spent a lot of time, we have the Reddick Houses, and we call the other area where people own and rent the back. And there's like a park that's somewhat of a demarcation line between us living in public housing and those living in rental or you know, owning their own homes. But the fact of the matter is, if I've been living in this apartment since 1989, and even if I only average $700, $800 a month rent, because believe me, 30% of your gross income is the formula for public housing. So I don't make $5 an hour as I did when I was 14. You know, I've stepped up a bit, but I've never been able to catch up because every year they want another cut of that 30%. So how do I accumulate wealth? And how do I take my self-sufficiency, what I've learned, what I've done, how am I able to move out of here? So I said that to say that when you talk about managed retreat, think really deep, because it could lead to civil wars. If seriously, like if people have to leave, and if we have to go live somewhere where we're not welcomed, you know, it's almost like going back to that time between 1916 and 1970, you know. And so I think that we should really think deeply, if we do have to do a managed retreat, on how we're going to do that. Where's my equity for the $300,000 to $400,000 that I spent in rent for this apartment? You know, I've been stuck in this apartment since 1989. So that's what, 30 years or more already. People pay mortgages for 15 years or 30 years. Why is it that American Blacks are stuck and veil-penned in public housing? And then when I say, you know what, I'll take it as is, the first thing the liberal says, you don't want that, it's in disrepair. Well, American Blacks have lived in barns. Go look at a prime documentary called The Cotton Picking Truth. 1960 something, Some Blacks thought they were still in slavery in Virginia and in certain parts of the country. So we got to factor in historically, you change things radically from the root. I can go to any state and pick out public housing based on the materials, the building materials, the design, and where people are getting shot by police. Because they're not going to go to the Hamptons and shoot someone, but they will come, to a place like Red Hook. So I just wanted to point that out.
No, if I could add one
Yeah.
little or anecdote from Edgemere that I think is really relevant. So there's, as I mentioned, Edgemere is half homeowners in 1 to 4 family homes. They're
Oh, Deborah
generally
froze for me.
low.
Okay. You might just want to say that last sentence again. I lost you for 1 second.
Sure. Edgemere is half public housing residents and half low and moderate income, generally people of color homeowners. And there's a really big divide between the homeowners and public housing residents and how they see their lives, what their experience is in the day of living in Edgemere when they're both, traveling really long commutes, having terrible infrastructure, dealing with the same flood risks, but living totally different worlds, and how they saw the future. And there was a lot of conflict about, particularly community gardens. Public housing residents wanted community gardens, and homeowners didn't want to see community gardens because they saw them as blighted half the year. And there was lots of other friction and tension that was pretty heinous. Racially the same, but both in a planning process of trying to meet the needs of both constituencies, which are very different, or make both feel heard, that's actually not possible because they want different things. That's an example of where one wants community gardens, one doesn't, almost equal numbers of people. But on the other hand, I'm looking at the toolkit of things I had, I showed you Desiree's new home. She's a low and moderate income homeowner. The city of New York spent an extraordinary amount of money to build that new resilient home. So she went from being a homeowner, with a significant mortgage, but she was a homeowner, to continuing to be a homeowner, but a homeowner of a structure worth hundreds of thousands of dollars more. Whereas for a renter, so a private market renter, we could pay 42 months of rent differential, which he was actually not paying rent at all, which is a whole other situation. But we gave him a housing voucher, which is useful for his life and longevity because it's, provides affordable housing access. But what is that in comparison? You spend hundreds of thousands of dollars giving an asset to someone, and you give someone else a sheet of paper that maybe discounts housing. That's not fair. And then in the context of how do you house people and how do you deal with risk? There was a lot more discussion about how can public housing residents continue to live in Edgemere? And people who own homes, they clearly just love living near the water. So they'll, they'll deal with it because they've made a choice, but we should make a choice for those public housing residents, and on behalf of them, rather than what do they want. Whereas those public housing residents who were able to get to engage in our discussions, some of them were can you help me move to Brownsville? Because why do I want to be in the Rockaways? It's really far here. It sucks. Some of them loved Edgemere. I don't want to paint a picture, but there were others who were I don't want to be here. I'm just stuck here. Get me out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that the post-disaster context is a really difficult one for housing policy in general. And it really speaks to me that we need housing policies like reparations or, expanding home ownership to a broader population that would be, act before these disasters. I mean, we need a societal transformation in this direction, especially as we face more disasters in the future. I was going to try to not editorialize too much today, but we only have a few minutes left. So Todd, thanks for putting the the information on in the chat there, but I wonder if you had any, maybe we could just go around for like a final thought, and you could either expand on that question and any other observations about the session today.
Well, yeah, thank you, Thad. And I'm really happy to have been able to participate in this conversation and to, like I said earlier, I'm always happy to talk about Pinhook. It's a story I think people need to know, and spent 10 years, working with the folks trying to get their story out as widely as possible. And I think it's still a story people need to know. I think, the difference between, thinking about these issues in urban areas and these issues in rural areas creates a lot of difference. And when I think about Pinhook, I think I also have to be, admit that they're in some ways a kind of unique community, because they moved to a place, although they were sort of forced to live there, but they did build a community together. So there was more of a sense of cohesiveness, I think, of that community. And even still, not everybody. So, Deborah was working all those years to get some kind of money to build some new houses somewhere, and not everybody stayed with her the whole time. I mean, people had to give up, right? They had to just go and relocate other places, live with their kids, or move to other towns, or, so it's not like they stayed together as an entire community for 7 years and then were relocated together somewhere. Even of the 9 houses that were built, 2 of them were built in different locations because the people, wanted to live closer to their kids or something like that, right? So even in a kind of almost maybe the most ideal example of a community that has cohesiveness, and they're all Black people except for there was one white woman who lived there. So they had that kind of cohesiveness. Even then, you had disagreements, or people not doing the same thing because their needs were different.
Thanks so much, Todd. There's this community coherence and cohesion, and what a unique and powerful thing that is. And so even if it's just 5 people, it's a value to all of us as a society to have that kind of community coherence. So I appreciate this kind of new metrics of valuing that community coherence and that shared legacy. Closing thoughts from Deborah. Do you want to go next? And then we'll give it to Karen to close.
Sure. I mean, I think, reflecting on the discussion here today, part of me wants to say, it's really important for us to start as a policymaker, like looking at our federal toolkit and what, both in the disaster context and the non-disaster context, what can we do to try and make the programs we have better and more people oriented rather than more programmatically distributive. I don't have a better way. I mean, particularly what happened in Pinhook makes me like so ill. But on the other hand, like I would just love to see a future where we can have just a social safety net that allows people the choices to make decisions about where they live so that they're in the communities where they want to live. And if that means traveling as a cohesive community to move away from risk, that's an option for them. If that's making individual choices for any variety of reasons, known or unknown, I would want to give them that independence. And that we look at this question of why do people live where they live, and try and think about what tools have pushed, what programs have pushed people into places where they may not have choices, and how can we give them choices and choices they want rather than like 2 bad options.
Thanks, Deborah. It's been great working with you on this, and I feel like we're like midway through a very long journey to have more enlightened policy on these questions. So thanks for being a great partner. And Karen, I'll leave it to you for a last word.
Sure. So I'm in the business of building social cohesion in my community. It does go back to the Compromise of 1877, though. You can't talk social cohesion or socialism without talking historically and building principles. So the way we do it is we have to have those deeper conversations and set up our principles to say that we're going to hold hands no matter what. No matter what happens, these 3 demands must be met. We're not going to go and wait until the 12th hour and tell the Army Corps of Engineers, oh, it's okay if you knock it off over there because, you know, that's the poorest section of our community. We're standing strong in Red Hook. We're very organized now. It's going on about 10 years of organizing since Sandy. And we had a jump start because we were already an alienated community. But I have a vision that I am a band orchestrator, and that the community plays different parts. And sometimes you can't put the bass right next to the clarinet. But if you put in a trumpet and a drum or two, then we can all play the same song together. And so I want to be strong in letting you know that Red Hook is socially cohesive. We are organized, and our model is spreading, and hopefully it'll come to a community near you. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks for ending on such a positive message and such a heavy topic. And, you know, it's been great to be a little quartet with the 3 of you today. So looking forward to more conversations, and enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye.